close your eyes for just a moment. I want you to imagine something real. Picture the greatest city that has ever existed on this earth, not in terms of military power, not in terms of political dominance, but in terms of raw human knowledge, a city where scholars from every corner of the known world gathered to think, to question, to discover. A city built around the radical idea that understanding the universe was the highest calling a human being could pursue. Now open your eyes, because that city actually existed. It stood on the northern coast of Egypt for nearly 1,000 years. It was called Alexandria, and at the center of its intellectual life, not on the margins, not in secret, but standing openly in public lecture halls, in streets, in the company of governors and astronomers and theologians, was a woman, not a priestess, not a queen, a philosopher and a mathematician, and she asked a question that has never fully gone away, a question that philosophers are still asking today, that neuroscientists are still wrestling with, that physicists are beginning to approach from entirely new directions, the question of what consciousness actually is, where it comes from, and what it tells us about the nature of reality itself. Her name was Hypatia of Alexandria. She lived 1,500 years before modern neuroscience existed, and the philosophical framework she taught her students is being rediscovered independently through entirely different methods by some of the most rigorous thinkers of the 21st century. This is her story, and it is also the story of an idea that refuses to disappear. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. This video is not going to tell you that history was hiding something from you. It is not going to claim that powerful forces suppressed a secret truth. What I am going to tell you is simply this: Hypatia of Alexandria was one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. Her story was genuinely neglected for centuries, partly due to the loss of her written work, and partly due to the way history was recorded in that era. And the philosophical questions she spent her life exploring have turned out to be among the most important and most difficult questions in all of human inquiry. That is not conspiracy. That is just history, and it is more than enough. Let us begin at the beginning. The year is approximately 355 AD. The place is Alexandria, Egypt. By this point in history, Alexandria had become the intellectual capital of the known world. The great library, or what remained of it, still housed hundreds of thousands of texts. The city was a meeting point of Greek philosophy, Egyptian tradition, Roman governance, Jewish theology, and a rapidly growing Christian community. It was a genuinely cosmopolitan place where multiple intellectual traditions existed side by side, and scholars from different backgrounds regularly engaged with each other's ideas. The atmosphere, while not palpable, without its tensions, was one in which open inquiry was still possible and still valued. And Hypatia was born directly into the heart of it. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, one of the most respected mathematicians and astronomers of his time, and the last known member of the Great Museum of Alexandria, the research institution connected to the library. Theon made a decision about his daughter that was almost unheard of in the ancient world. He chose to raise her not as women were typically raised in that era, in preparation for marriage and domestic life, but as a full intellectual equal. From childhood, he trained her rigorously in mathematics, in astronomy, in rhetoric, in music, in philosophy. Ancient sources record that his stated intention was to raise what he called a perfect human being, and by every historical measure we have access to, the result exceeded anything he imagined. By the time Hypatia reached adulthood, she had not merely matched her father, she had surpassed him. She produced original mathematical commentaries on algebra, on conic sections, on astronomical systems that became standard teaching texts across the Mediterranean world. She designed scientific instruments, including a refined version of the astrolabe, used for measuring the positions of celestial bodies. She corresponded with political leaders, with bishops, with philosophers and scientists across the empire. In a civilization that almost universally excluded women from public, intellectual life, Hypatia was not merely an exception. She was at the center. Powerful, educated men traveled from across the Roman world specifically to study with her, because the quality of her thinking was simply unmatched by anyone else available to them. But Hypatia was not only a mathematician, she was a philosopher, and the philosophical tradition she taught, Neoplatonism, is where things become genuinely fascinating for anyone interested in the history of ideas and in the questions that science is still grappling with today. Neoplatonism was developed by Plotinus in the 3rd century AD, built on foundations laid by Plato, and it offered a comprehensive account of reality that was in many ways more sophisticated and more internally consistent than the materialist frameworks that would dominate Western thought for centuries afterward. At its core, Neoplatonism proposed that reality is not simply the physical world observable by the senses. Reality, in the Neoplatonic view, is layered and hierarchical. The material world, the world of physical objects and events, is the outermost and in some sense the least fundamental layer. Beneath it, or rather underlying it, are more fundamental levels. Soul, which is the animating principle flowing through living things' mind, a pure transcendent intelligence that structures existence, and at the absolute foundation, something Plotinus called the ultimate ground of all being, beyond all description and all categories, the source from which everything emanates the way light continuously emanates from the sun. Now here is the philosophically interesting part. Neoplatonism held that the human soul is not ultimately separate from this ground of being. It originates from it, it participates in it, and through sustained philosophical practice, through what Plotinus called the turning of the attention inward and upward, a person could, in principle, experience direct contact with the deeper layers of reality, not through ritual, not through institutional mediation, through the disciplined, rigorous practice of philosophical inquiry directed at one's own consciousness. This was a profound and in many ways radical philosophical claim. It meant that the most important truths about reality were not located somewhere external and inaccessible, but were in some sense always already present within the structure of conscious experience itself. The path to understanding was interior. Consciousness itself was the most direct window onto the deepest nature of things. Hypatia taught this tradition to hundreds of students over decades of her career. Among her most devoted students was Synesius of Cyrene, who went on to become a bishop and one of the significant Christian theologians of his era. The letters Synesius wrote to Hypatia throughout his life, letters that historians still have access to, today make it absolutely clear that he considered her the most important teacher of his intellectual life, one of the people he most deeply admired. She welcomed students from every background. She did not care what religious tradition you came from. She cared about the quality of your thinking and the seriousness of your inquiry. What she valued above everything else was genuine philosophical rigor, the honest, disciplined pursuit of understanding wherever it led. Now we need to talk honestly about the historical context of what happened to Hypatia, because it is a complicated story and it deserves to be told with nuance rather than simplified into a morality tale. By 412 AD, a man named Cyril had become the Bishop of Alexandria. Cyril was by any historical measure an extraordinarily capable and determined institutional leader. He was also operating in an environment of intense political competition. Alexandria in the early 5th century was a city where religious, civil, and cultural authority were all being renegotiated simultaneously. The relationship between the church, the Roman civil administration, and the various philosophical and religious communities in the city was genuinely unstable. Cyril was in sustained conflict with Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, the highest civil authority in the city. This was fundamentally a political conflict about jurisdiction and authority, the kind of conflict that was playing out across the empire as the church grew in power and influence. Orestes happened to be a close friend and former student of Hypatia, and Hypatia, as the most prominent intellectual figure in the city and someone with deep connections to civil leadership, was inevitably caught in the middle of these tensions. Ancient sources record that rumors began circulating in the city about Hypatia, that she was using her influence over Orestes to prevent resolution between the civil and ecclesiastical authorities. The historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing within a generation of the events, records that in March of 415 AD, a mob seized Hypatia from her carriage and killed her with extraordinary brutality. Socrates himself, a Christian historian, was clearly troubled by what he described and wrote that the murder brought great disgrace upon Cyril and upon the Alexandrian church. Other ancient sources corroborate the basic account. The event happened. It was violent, it was wrong, and it was seen as wrong even by Christian contemporaries who recorded it. What we should be careful not to do is use this single terrible event to draw sweeping conclusions about the inevitable conflict between religion and philosophy or between faith and reason. The historical reality is more complex. Christianity in this era contained enormous internal diversity. Many Christians were devoted Platonists. Many of the greatest theologians of the early church were deeply influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the same era, acknowledged his profound debt to the Platonists. The conflict that ended Hypatia's life was as much a political conflict as a theological one, and reducing it to a simple story of religion suppressing knowledge does a disservice to the genuine complexity of what happened. What is true, and what is historically significant, is that after Hypatia's death, the conditions in Alexandria that had allowed open philosophical inquiry to flourish began to deteriorate. Her original writings, her mathematical commentaries, whatever philosophical texts she may have produced, were lost. We know her primarily through what her students wrote about her and through fragments preserved in other works. This loss is genuinely significant. We cannot know with certainty the full extent of what she thought and taught. The Hypatia we can reconstruct from historical sources is a remarkable figure, but she is inevitably incomplete. And yet the tradition she taught Neoplatonism did not disappear. It continued to flow through the history of Western thought in fascinating and sometimes unexpected ways. In the Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino translated the complete works of Plato and Plotinus into Latin, making the Neoplatonic tradition widely accessible for the first time in centuries and profoundly influencing the development of Renaissance humanism. The Cambridge Platonists of the 17th century engaged seriously with Neoplatonic ideas about the nature of mind and reality. And in the 20th century, Carl Jung drew extensively on this tradition consciously and explicitly in developing his framework for understanding the psyche. Jung's relationship to the Neoplatonic tradition is worth pausing on because it illustrates something genuinely interesting about the history of ideas. Jung was not a philosopher in the ancient sense. He was a psychiatrist who spent decades carefully observing the inner lives of his patients and developing theoretical frameworks to make sense of what he observed. But the frameworks he arrived at bear striking resemblances to the Neoplatonic account of the structure of consciousness. His concept of the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared across individual human beings, containing patterns and images that no single life could have produced, maps interestingly onto the Neoplatonic concept of soul as a shared animating intelligence underlying individual minds. His concept of the self, the deepest organizing center of the psyche, which transcends the ego while being the most intimate thing a person can encounter, resonates with the Neoplatonic understanding of the soul's relationship to the One. Now I want to be precise about something here because precision matters. Jung did not claim to be rediscovering Neoplatonism. He was doing psychology empirical, clinical, grounded in observation. The resemblances between his framework and the ancient philosophical tradition are striking, and he was aware of them. He wrote about the Neoplatonists and engaged with their ideas directly. But the resemblance does not mean that. Jung simply translated ancient philosophy into modern language, or that Hypatia somehow anticipated 20th century depth psychology in any direct sense. What it suggests is something more interesting. That when serious thinkers, working from very different starting points and using very different methods, turn their attention carefully to the structure of human consciousness, they tend to encounter similar features. The territory has a shape, and different explorers, approaching it from different directions, begin to describe similar contours. This brings us to the most contemporary, and in some ways most surprising part of this story, because something remarkable is happening at the frontier of consciousness research right now. The hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by the philosopher David Chalmers, refers to the question of why physical processes in the brain produce subjective experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does information processing in your brain feel like anything from the inside? This is not a question about how the brain processes information or generates behavior. Those questions are difficult, but in principle tractable. The hard problem is the question of why there is inner experience at all, why the lights are on, so to speak, and it is a question that materialist neuroscience has so far been completely unable to answer. What is striking is that several serious philosophers and scientists working rigorously, within the frameworks of contemporary academic philosophy and physics, have concluded that the most promising way to approach this problem involves taking seriously the possibility that consciousness is not produced by physical processes, but is in some sense fundamental, a basic feature of reality, rather than a byproduct of complexity. David Chalmers at New York University has written extensively about what he calls panpsychism, the idea that some form of experiential quality is present at all levels of physical reality, not only in brains. Bernardo Kastrup has developed a framework called analytical idealism, arguing from philosophical and scientific grounds that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality and that the physical world as we observe it is best understood as existing within consciousness, rather than consciousness existing within the physical world. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have proposed that consciousness involves quantum processes at the level of microtubules in neurons, a controversial but seriously debated hypothesis that connects quantum physics to the mystery of inner experience. None of these thinkers are making the claim that they are reviving ancient Neoplatonism. They are working within contemporary academic philosophy and physics, using contemporary methods and contemporary evidence. But the direction their thinking points toward consciousness as fundamental rather than derived, toward the ground of reality being in some sense palpable. Mind-like rather than purely material is a direction that would have been recognizable to Hypatia and her tradition, not because ancient philosophy directly anticipated modern science, but because the questions being asked are, at a deep level, the same questions. What is consciousness? Is it produced by matter? Or is it in some sense more fundamental than matter? What does the existence of inner experience tell us about the nature of reality? These are not new questions. They are among the oldest questions human beings have ever asked. What is new is that the tools of 21st century science and philosophy are bringing unprecedented rigor to bear on them, and the answers that rigorous inquiry is beginning to suggest are not the ones that a purely materialist framework would have predicted. Hypatia of Alexandria spent her life teaching that consciousness was not a peripheral feature of reality, but something central to it, that the inner life of the human mind was not a random byproduct of physical processes, but a window onto something deep about the structure of existence. She could not have known that 15 centuries later, physicists and philosophers would be asking versions of the same question using entirely different tools. She could not have anticipated Chalmers or Kastrup or Penrose any more than Newton could have anticipated quantum mechanics, but the questions she was asking were real questions. They were hard questions, and they have not gone away. There is something genuinely moving about that continuity, not a direct intellectual lineage, not a straight line from Hypatia to Jung to modern physics, but something more like the persistence of a question that keeps reasserting itself regardless of which tradition is asking it, a question that refuses to be dissolved by any framework that tries to dismiss it. The question of what consciousness is, where it comes from, and what it tells us about the nature of reality is one of the most profound questions in all of human inquiry. Hypatia devoted her life to it. The greatest minds of our own era are devoting their careers to it. And the answer, whatever it turns out to be, is going to matter enormously. Hypatia died in March of 415 AD. She was approximately 60 years old. She was killed brutally, in the city she had spent her life enriching, in a moment of political and religious violence that her own contemporaries recognized as wrong. Her written work was lost. Her name faded from history for centuries. The full extent of what she knew and thought and taught we will never recover, but her questions survived. They survived in the Neoplatonic tradition that continued after her death. They survived in the mystical strands of every major religious tradition. They survived in the work of every philosopher who ever turned their attention seriously to the mystery of inner experience. They survived in Jung's decades of careful observation of the human psyche, and they are capable, surviving now, in the laboratories and seminar rooms where the hardest problem in all of science is being approached with fresh tools and genuine intellectual humility. You are living at a moment when those questions are more alive than they have been in a very long time. When the consensus that consciousness is simply what the brain does is beginning to crack under the weight of its own inadequacy. When serious, credentialed thinkers are beginning to take seriously again the possibility that the ancient intuition that consciousness is not produced by the universe but is somehow woven into its deepest fabric might actually be pointing at something true. Hypatia of Alexandria knew that the questions mattered. She knew that asking them honestly, rigorously, without flinching, was one of the most important things a human being could do. She was right about that. She has always been right about that. And now you know her name. If this story opened something in you, if a question surfaced while you were watching that you want to think about more carefully, leave it in the comments below. Not just a reaction, an actual question. Because the best conversations this channel has are the ones where the questions are real. The next video goes deeper into the hard problem of consciousness, what it actually is, why it matters so much, and what the most serious thinkers working on it today are finding. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. And if you know someone who takes these questions seriously, someone who has wondered about the nature of consciousness, about what the mind really is, about what ancient philosophy might still have to teach us, share this video with them today. These conversations are worth having, and they are better when more serious people are part of them.
I personally researched, wrote and prepared this video to bring your accurate and meaningful content. Subscribe for more original content.